How do some people walk into a room and instantly change the energy? They're not always the smartest person. They're not always the funniest, and they're often not the most attractive. But people pay attention to them and they remember them. So, what do they do that the rest of us don't? And can that ability to draw people in actually be learned? I'm Lynn Toman, and this is Three Takeaways. Today, I'm excited to be with Olivia Fox Cabane. Olivia is the author of the fascinating book, The Charisma Myth. It has become a go to book for leaders, entrepreneurs, and professionals around the world. She argues that charisma isn't a mysterious gift people are born with, it's a skill. And once you understand how it works, you can learn it. Welcome, Olivia, and thanks so much for joining Three Takeaways today.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here, Lynn.
It is my pleasure. Let's start with your wonderful story about Marilyn Monroe in Grand Central Station. Nobody notices her, and then moments later, she becomes Marilyn Monroe, and suddenly everyone notices. Tell us that story and what exactly changed.
So, this is one of the best illustrations of charisma as not a stable inherent quality, but rather something that can be turned on and off at will. And this was in 1955. It was in summer. Marilyn wanted to prove that just by deciding to, she could be either glamorous Miss Monroe or just plain Norma Jean Baker. So, she took both a photographer and a reporter with her down into Grand Central Station, and she stood quietly on the platform and then boarded the train car, and no one noticed her. Even though the photographer was with her and the camera was clicking the whole time, apparently not a single person realized it was Marilyn. Then they get to the station, they emerge, and then she turns towards the photographer and the reporter and says, "So, you want to see Marilyn?" And then they said, it was almost like magic. There was no grand gestures. She just struck a pose, fluffed up her hair, but suddenly it seemed that she became magnetic, and it was as if an aura rippled out from her, and the crowd instantly realized that Marilyn was around them. Apparently, it took several minutes to extract her from the shoving crowd, which was becoming quite hysterical, realizing that, oh, it's Marilyn. So she was able to turn her charisma on and off. And that is just one of the most vivid illustrations of charisma as a transient quality that is behavior dependent.
So, what did she actually do to create that magnetic aura?
So, when researchers have people in controlled laboratory experiments, they are able to raise and lower people's level of charisma as if they were turning a dial by instructing them to display certain behaviors. The behaviors that they're asking them to display, the same that Marilyn was displaying, they fall broadly into three categories. There are the behaviors of power. Sometimes studies call them confidence or dominance, but broadly it's power. There are the behaviors of warmth. Sometimes studies will call them affability, friendliness, receptivity, broadly warmth. And behaviors of presence. Essentially, it's, are you fully present in the moment? Do you feel confident? And do you feel warm and caring? If you have all three, you will be charismatic.
So, it's really massive confidence that you're talking about.
That's one of the main drivers of charisma. But what's really interesting is that you do need all three. It's really interesting that someone who is very warm and very confident, but totally distracted, someone who just has no presence, that impairs their charisma. Someone who is very warm and very present, but has no confidence, still no charisma. It turns out that it's kind of like a chemical formulation. You really need all three elements to get charisma. The only thing that changes is the kind of charisma you get, depending on which of these elements is highest.
So, charisma isn't something you are, it's something you do.
Charisma is absolutely a set of learned behaviors. The reason that we think it's innate is that usually those behaviors are learned really early in life, so that by the time we meet the charismatic people, it looks as if it were natural. But you can see with certain people like Steve Jobs, former CEO of Apple, you can actually see him learn charisma step by step from his first presentations in the early 80s to his final presentations. You can first see him learn presence, then he learns power, and finally he learns warmth. And when he put all those three together in his final presentations, he was incredibly charismatic.
So I've watched some of his early presentations. He's awkward, he's even a little uncomfortable looking. What specifically did he do in his later presentations?
So if you look at what he learned first, it was the ability to look at the camera, to stay attentive to whoever he was speaking to, whether it was a one on one or whether it was to a group. That was the element of presence. Presence really is the ability to stay present in the moment and not be away in your head. It can be called mindfulness, attentiveness, but it's the ability to stay present. That's what he learned first. What he learned second is power, the confidence. And you can see he starts even using the techniques of stage magicians to direct the audience's attention by pulling, for example, a small white iPod out of a black bag and he's wearing all black. So there's really an element of controlling the audience's attention. And what's really interesting is the final element he learned, the last was warmth. Now, Steve Jobs was not emanating warmth towards his customers or the audience. Everyone knows Steve Jobs is not a particularly nice person, but he loved his products. And you can feel the enthusiasm and the warmth for the product in the way he's describing it. And when he got all those three elements at once, he had the massive confidence. This is the best product ever. Steve Jobs, Carmine Gallo said it best. Steve Jobs wasn't selling computers. He was selling the promise of a better world. It was that level of confidence plus the attentiveness, the presence, and the warmth that made him the ultra charismatic CEO he ended up as.
So fascinating. What's the biggest misconception that people have about charisma?
I think the first biggest misconception is that it's innate, it's a magical quality, you have it or you don't, or it's genetic. Now, I have to be honest and say that there are genetic predispositions. I can't turn everyone into Bill Clinton. It is true that certain tendencies, certain personality traits will make certain forms of charisma easier than others. Extroversion makes certain forms of charisma easier than others. But here's the thing, a lot of people fall for the second myth, which is that only extroverts can be charismatic. Not true. Introversion is a huge advantage for other forms of charisma, like focus charisma. Because here's the key thing people forget: charisma is only partly how you make people feel about you, it's even more how you make them feel about themselves.
Before I come back to that, are there lessons from Steve Jobs that anyone can apply?
I would argue actually it's possible that you can if. One of the most interesting things for me was looking at how, why is it that so often it is the political leaders, it is the sometimes even cult leaders who become charismatic? Well, it's true there's a chicken and egg question because it's easier to become a political or cult leader if you are charismatic. But it's also true that if you find a cause you deeply believe in, that will actually give you all three elements. Because if it's a cause you really care about, you're going to be fully present in the subject. You're genuinely interested in the subject. If it's a cause you deeply care about, that gives you the warmth, the enthusiasm, the passion. And because you think this cause is the right cause, that's going to give you the confidence that this is what we should care about. And if you look at Steve Jobs, all those three, he absolutely thought Apple was the single most important company in the world. So, in a way, one of the lessons we can learn is that if you believe as deeply as he did that what you are selling to the world, what you are bringing to the world, the work you are doing is going to change the world, that will give you all three elements of charisma, the best chance you have of acquiring all three.
When you look across charismatic people like Marilyn Monroe, Steve Jobs, Oprah, Barack Obama, is there one thing that they all do that most people simply don't?
That's a really good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question before. The answer that most people would assume is that they're all always super confident, but that's not actually true since a lot of these figures were known to actually have really high imposter syndromes or inner critic. I would say that if there is one key element that brings all three together is that when they were being charismatic, they were fully present in the moment. Marilyn was known to light up when cameras were around because being under a camera apparently made her feel alive and okay again. And so she would really be fully present when there was a camera rolling. So, my guess would be that the commonality, even more than power or warmth, is actually, if you look at the Dalai Lama, he's famous for being so completely present in the moment. I would say that that is probably the one characteristic.
Hmm, interesting. And that applies as well to Oprah or Barack Obama?
I would say so, yes.
Interesting. Bill Clinton famously makes everyone feel like the only person in the room, and yet almost nobody else actually does this. Why is it so powerful?
So, this is where we have to get slightly politically incorrect. Is there a correlation between charisma and narcissism? The answer is yes. Science has shown that there absolutely is. One of the reasons that I'm so keen to democratize charisma and make it widely available to everyone is so that it is not just the people who don't always behave the best who have the charisma. One of the things you'll hear say about Bill Clinton is that in that moment, he genuinely believes that you are the most important person in the room. And because he genuinely believes it, that is what he communicates. For me, one of the most important lessons in charisma that the science showed again and again is that you actually cannot fake charisma. The reason for that is because there is so much body language emanating for you every minute that even if you control the main expression on your face, the macro expression, sooner or later, if what you feel inside is different, what's called a micro expression will flash. And if there's a difference between your micro and macro, you will get what's called an incongruence, and it will feel on a gut level that you're being inauthentic. So you need the ability to convince yourself in the moment that you are really feeling what you are trying to portray. Some people, Clinton is apparently a master at this, are able to, in the moment, truly believe this is the most extraordinary and beautiful woman I have ever encountered. And therefore, that is what they project when they are with that person. One of the tricks to doing that is that the brain is not very good at distinguishing between imagination and reality. So, if you can find even small things about the other person that you can approve of. Have you ever had the experience that, let me phrase it this way. Have you ever had the experience that a day when all the little things go wrong is actually harder to bear than a day when one big thing goes wrong? That's because the brain is terrible at scale. And so lots of little things can feel heavier to bear than one big thing. If you can find three or more small things about the other person that you really approve of, and I don't care whether it's nice shoes or I like their haircut, they were on time,
Mhm.
that sends your brain down a certain path. And if you have enough of those small things, you will be genuinely emitting the right body language. But the key lesson is this: it has to be real.
The really interesting thing to me about Bill Clinton is that when he's making everybody he talks to feel so special, he's not talking about himself. He's not being smart or, talking about great things he's done. What he's really doing is just focusing on the other person.
My favorite story to illustrate exactly that point is when William Gladstone was running against Benjamin Disraeli for the post of Prime Minister to the British Empire. And one young lady happened to go to dinner on consecutive evenings with both of the rivals. And so, of course, the press asked her afterwards what impressions they'd made on her. And she said, after dining with Mr. Gladstone, I thought he was the cleverest man in England. But after dining with Mr. Disraeli, I thought I was the cleverest woman in England. And of course, Disraeli won because he made her feel like the cleverest person in the room. Charisma is how you make people feel about themselves.
And why is that so rare?
That's a really good question. Why is it so rare? I think it's because that we are in an environment where social media and constant comparisons and advertising make it so easy for us to be so self-critical that we are always worried about how we are appearing. And so we're always worried about, am I being confident enough or looking good enough? And because there's this um, real pressure to reach a certain standard all the time, we have a lot of us a very strong inner critic. And so, ironically, that makes us more self focused. Whereas if we were less worried about how we appear, we would be more able to focus on the other person.
It sounds almost too simple, but is being fully present and focused on the other person becoming a superpower simply because it's become so rare?
It really is, Lynn. I would say that if you look, especially at the younger generations, I really believe that we are living in this world of continuous, partial, shallow attention. And so, if you are one of the few people who are able to give others a sustained, continuous attention, you really stand out from the crowd. And it really makes people feel exceptionally heard and listened to.
Most people picture charisma as extroverted and commanding people, but you've said that introverts can also be charismatic. Who are some examples?
So keep in mind that he has changed, but when I met him, Elon Musk was a remarkable example of focus charisma when at that time, this would have been 15 years ago, he was absolutely an introvert, but he had the ability to give you the impression he was so fully focused, drinking in every word you said and listening to every nuance, that it really was a kind of focus charisma that I have heard people who spend time with Bill Gates will tell you the same, that Bill actually is very charismatic when you meet him, and not in an extroverted way, but in a making you feel like the center of attention kind of way.
So interesting. I would not have guessed that. The MIT Media Lab could predict, without even listening to the words of a negotiation, how the negotiation was going. What does that tell us about what we're actually responding to in other people?
So it was a fascinating study when it was first done in 2008, and they were indeed able to model the outcome of negotiations and sales pitches and business plan pitches with over 80% accuracy without listening to a single word of content. And what they measured instead were things like the ratio of speaking to listening. The more you listened, the more successful you were. Hello, introverts who don't need the spotlight on themselves. The ratio of vocal fluctuation, more fluctuation, better. The excitement and confidence, it was essentially not the words you said. They didn't listen to a single word. But this proved how important your body language and your attention were in charisma. We had studies before that were showing that body language is a key component in all of communication, that nonverbal communication is a big part of it. But this really showed that, at least in these instances, more than 80% of prediction could be done without a single word. So when I'm talking to young startup founders, I have to tell them, listen, if you're spending all your time on the PowerPoint presentation, that's great, but that's less than 20% of your impact. The rest of the 80% is not what you say, it's how you say it.
So, body language is more important than words.
It really is.
And what are people looking for in body language?
If you look at the three elements, if you look at the power, the presence, the warmth, it's going to be how much space they take up, for example. That's one of the ways that people communicate confidence. And one of the issues that women, for example, can have is that in many cultures, women are taught to be small, to make themselves smaller. And so they will often tilt their head to make themselves, this is the little girl head tilt of please like me, I'm inoffensive, I'm harmless. Or they will stand on one leg, or they will cross their arms in front of them. And if you look at what alpha humans do, it's actually the opposite. They'll sit on one chair, they'll put their arm on another chair, they'll put their legs on a third chair. And so learning how to take up space, both with your body language and with the volume of your voice, it
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily mean be so loud you're deafening, but it does mean don't be afraid to have a strong presence. That's one of the key components.
Is that why some people can be credible before they've even said anything important?
It is one of the fascinating areas of research in charisma is first impressions, technically called thin slicing. And that was looking at how people make first impressions in under 2 seconds before they've said a word. People will judge you, your level of friendliness, social success, competence, trustworthiness. It's remarkable how many judgments are made before you say a single word.
So, essentially, we are all subconsciously reading one another all the time.
All the time, thousands of units of body language are pouring out from you every minute.
If everyone listening said, I want to become more charismatic over the next month, what's the single highest leverage change they could make? And what would be the first thing that other people would actually notice?
Have you ever been in a conversation when you said something and your brain goes, "Ooh, that was stupid"?
Of course.
What happens to your face when you think that?
I'm sure it portrays something awful,
It
complete lack of confidence, thinking
right?
that you're
It
stupid.
winces. Yeah, so here's the interesting thing. When that happens, your face can wince or cringe. Now, this is self directed judgment. This is self directed coldness and criticism, but they don't know that. All they know is that while you were looking at them, listening to them, and presumably thinking about them, they accurately read coldness, criticism, and judgment on your face.
Mm.
This is why one of the biggest reasons to learn how to handle your inner critic better is because it ruins your body language and thus your charisma. So, the single biggest first step in becoming charismatic, interestingly enough, is learning self forgiveness. And that's the fascinating thing when people ask me, how can I increase my self confidence? The really interesting thing is that it often comes through the route of self compassion.
Hmm, so interesting. Olivia, give us the playbook. What other things could people do starting tomorrow that would immediately start to make them more charismatic?
If you can take 5 minutes between meetings, just 5 minutes, that can make a real difference in your level of charisma. So, one of the things that peak performance scientists have seen in both athletes and people at work is that we expect our brains to come into work, ramp up to peak performance, stay at peak performance the whole day, and then ramp down. That's not how the brain works. It turns out that our brains work more like by oscillation. And so, giving yourself even 5 minutes between meetings to let your brain wander, let your concentration go. Maybe you don't look at your phone. That's not a valid break, but a total break of staring out the window and letting yourself daydream, that can have a real impact on your ability to then get back into a more charismatic mode. So, short breaks between meetings can make a big difference. Learning how to handle the imposter syndrome, which is different from the inner critic. The imposter syndrome is that voice in your head that tells you that you don't really know what you're doing and it's only a matter of time before you're found out and exposed as a fraud. And as it turns out, this is so common that at one point it was measured that it was estimated that almost 80% of the adult population experienced it at some point or another. So, learning how to destigmatize this is a completely normal feeling, everyone has it. De dramatize. The imposter syndrome is just a feeling, it is not actually necessarily a reflection of reality. And rewrite your current reality with the knowledge that you are actually competent at this or that task because look at your track record. The imposter syndrome looks at what you do. The inner critic looks at who you are. Learning how to handle both of these is honestly going to have the biggest impact on your ability to be charismatic in a day to day.
Olivia, you've studied charisma for a long time. Is there anything about charisma that you've changed your mind about?
Yes, there has. I was under the impression with a lot of people that lower voices are automatically more charismatic. That's not what the data show. As it turns out, a high pitched voice can be plenty charismatic. And Oliver Niebuhr, who's the guy in digital and vocal charisma, when he studied Steve Jobs, showed that Jobs's voice was occasionally so high it went into the female register. But because it had a nice fluctuation and because it had the critical drops, if you listen to how you say a sentence, the difference between the sky is blue and the sky is blue. It is the drop at the end of a sentence and even at sentence breaks that communicate confidence, conviction, and authority. And because he had those drops, his voice was incredibly charismatic. So I have learned that you can have a very high pitched voice that is still charismatic as long as it fluctuates and does the correct drops.
Olivia, what are the three takeaways you would like to leave the audience with today?
The first and most important takeaway is that charisma is not innate. It can be learned, and it's just a set of behaviors. The second takeaway is that charisma cannot be faked. Charismatic behaviors must originate in the mind because whatever your mind believes, your body will manifest. The third takeaway is that the best way to increase your level of self confidence is actually to increase your capacity for self forgiveness. The route to increased self confidence is through self compassion.
I love that. Thank you, Olivia. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I also really enjoyed your book, The Charisma Myth.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.